A billionaire's daughter, lost and terrified, collapses in a stormy forest, her life hanging by a thread. A struggling farmer finds her and saves her, but neither of them knows the shocking truth. Her family's empire is about to destroy his entire world. As secrets unravel and their lives collide, will they fight together or fall apart? What happens next will leave you speechless. The storm raged with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if the heavens themselves had turned against her. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the endless forest ahead, and with every deafening clap of thunder, Isabella Hayes pushed forward, her breaths ragged, her body trembling from exhaustion. Her once pristine designer dress, a symbol of the life she was so desperate to escape, now hung in soaked tatters, clinging to her as a reminder of her vulnerability. She tripped over an exposed root and hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Pain shot through her knees, but she barely noticed. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking her to the core. Somewhere, an owl screeched, its haunting cry lost in the storm's chaos. She lay there for a moment, face pressed against the wet earth, her mind screaming at her to move but her body refusing to obey. "Get up, Isabella," she muttered to herself, her voice drowned by the storm. But when she tried to stand, her legs gave out. Her chest heaved as tears mixed with rain on her muddied face. The world around her was a swirling void of shadows and noise, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly, utterly powerless. The day had started so differently. That morning, Isabella was the picture of privilege, seated at the head of a gleaming oak table in her family's lavish estate. Her father, Robert Hayes, a man whose fortune could buy him anything but the warmth of his daughter's love, spoke with his usual cold authority, instructing her on the importance of image and responsibility. Isabella had smiled politely, her practiced mask in place, but inside, frustration simmered. She was tired of being her father's doll, her every move controlled, her future preordained. When he criticized her for being reckless, something in her snapped. "Maybe I wouldn't be reckless if you didn't treat me like a prisoner," she had fired back. Her father's response was as cutting as ever. "You'll stay here, Isabella. Under this roof. You clearly can't handle life without guidance." The words echoed in her ears even now, hours later, as she crouched in the cold forest, clutching at a nearby tree for support. She had stormed out of the estate, grabbed her keys, and driven as far as she could, her anger fueling her reckless speed. But her car had skidded off the wet road near the forest, slamming into a shallow ditch. With no cell service and no clear plan, she had done what any determined woman would, ventured into the woods, believing she'd find help. But help never came. Instead, the forest swallowed her whole, each turn leading her deeper into its labyrinth of darkness. Now, with her strength waning and the storm showing no signs of mercy, she wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. A distant sound broke through her thoughts, a dog barking. At first, she thought she was imagining it, her mind conjuring the sound out of desperation. But then it came again, sharper this time, accompanied by the faint crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. Her pulse quickened. "Hello," she called, her voice hoarse and barely audible over the storm. She tried to stand again, using the tree for support, her body trembling as she forced herself upright. "Is someone there?" The barking grew louder, closer. Isabella squinted into the darkness, her breath catching as she spotted a flicker of light, a lantern swinging gently in the storm's chaos. The glow bobbed closer, revealing a tall figure cloaked in a raincoat, a scruffy dog at his side. The man's movements were deliberate, cautious, as he approached. Isabella's fear and relief battled for dominance. She had no idea who this man was, but the sight of another human in the endless void of the forest made her legs buckle. She collapsed back to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she gasped, "Please, I'm lost. I don't know what to do." The man stopped a few feet away, his dog barking protectively at her. He raised the lantern, its light revealing a face that was both weathered and kind. His deep-set eyes studied her with equal parts concern and wariness. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, cutting through the storm like a lifeline. "You're okay now," he said. "I'll help you." He crouched down, extending a calloused hand toward her. Isabella hesitated, her instinct to distrust battling with her desperate need for safety. Finally, she reached out, letting his strong grip steady her as he helped her to her feet. "You're freezing," he said, shrugging off his raincoat and draping it over her shoulders. "My cabin's not far. Can you walk?" Isabella nodded weakly, though every muscle in her body screamed in protest. As the man guided her through the woods, his dog trotting close by, Isabella felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know who this stranger was, but for the first time that night, she believed she might make it out of the forest alive. Liam Carter's cabin sat at the edge of the forest, a modest structure weathered by time but maintained with care. The roof sagged slightly, and the paint had long since peeled, revealing the raw wood beneath. Inside, it was sparse yet functional. A simple table and chairs, a patched-up sofa, and shelves lined with jars of preserves and tools. The smell of wood smoke hung in the air, a comforting reminder of the stove that served as both the cabin's heart and its only source of warmth. Liam had been preparing to turn in for the night when Max's frantic barking pulled him from his routine. Grabbing his lantern and pulling on his coat, he stepped out into the rain, following the dog's lead. Max darted through the trees, his barks echoing through the storm. When Liam finally reached the creek, his breath caught at the sight before him. A young woman lay crumpled on the ground, her dress soaked and torn, her body pale and motionless. Liam's pulse quickened. Without a second thought, he knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Carefully, he scooped her up, his strong arms cradling her as he carried her back to the cabin, Max trailing close behind. Once inside, Liam placed her gently on the sofa and stoked the fire in the wood stove until it blazed. He draped a blanket over her and left to fetch dry clothes. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the cabin felt like a safe haven. Max curled up at the foot of the sofa, keeping a watchful eye on the stranger. When Isabella woke, disoriented and shivering, the first thing she noticed was the warmth. Her eyes fluttered open, and she took in her surroundings, the rustic cabin, the flickering fire, and the faint smell of smoke and earth. Panic flared as she tried to sit up, only for pain and exhaustion to pull her back down. "You're awake?" came a calm, steady voice. She turned her head to see Liam sitting across from her, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up, his blue eyes assessing her with quiet concern. "Take it easy. You've had a rough night." "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice barely audible. "My cabin," he replied simply. "Found you by the creek. You were in pretty bad shape." Her instinctive defensiveness kicked in. "I didn't ask for your help." Liam raised an eyebrow but didn't seem offended. "No, you didn't," he said. "But leaving you out there wasn't an option." Isabella hesitated, unsure how to respond. She was used to people bending over backward to cater to her needs, either out of obligation or fear of her father. This man seemed different, calm, unaffected, and unwilling to coddle her. "Thank you," she said begrudgingly, her voice barely above a whisper. Over the next few hours, Liam's quiet kindness began to wear down Isabella's defenses. He brought her a steaming bowl of soup, which she accepted with reluctant gratitude. When he offered her dry clothes, a flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants, she hesitated, but the thought of staying in her wet dress was unbearable. She changed in the small bathroom, the oversized clothes unfamiliar but oddly comforting. By morning, the storm had passed, and the sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows revealed more of her surroundings. She noticed the worn but neatly organized tools on the walls, the jars of preserved vegetables, and the faint smell of soil that seemed to cling to everything. It was a stark contrast to the pristine luxury she was used to, but there was something grounding about it. Liam was outside tending to his small garden when she ventured to the door, her legs still unsteady. She watched as he worked, his movements deliberate and focused. Max followed him closely, occasionally barking at a bird or squirrel. When Liam noticed her, he straightened and wiped his hands on his jeans. "You should be resting," he said, walking over. "I'm fine," Isabella replied, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "What are you doing?" "Trying to keep these plants alive," he said with a small smile. "It's been a dry season, tough on the crops, Over the next few days, as Isabella recovered, she learned more about Liam and his life. The farm had been in his family for generations, but it was barely holding on now. The drought had devastated his fields, and with little money to invest in irrigation, his prospects were grim. Despite the hardships, Liam remained uncomplaining, his resilience and selflessness a stark contrast to the world Isabella knew. As they spent more time together, their conversations grew deeper. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Liam opened up about his past. He spoke of losing his parents in a car accident when he was 18 and how he had taken over the farm to honor their memory. "I don't want to let it go," he admitted, staring into the flames. "This land, this cabin, it's all I have left of them." Isabella listened intently, her usual bravado replaced by genuine interest. She found herself admiring Liam's quiet strength, his dedication to a life so different from her own. For the first time, she shared her own frustrations, the weight of her father's expectations, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only cared about her family's wealth. "He doesn't see me," she said bitterly. "To him, I'm just an extension of his empire." Liam looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "Sounds like a lonely way to live." "It is," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. Their bond deepened with each shared story, but not everything was easy. One afternoon, as Liam was outside chopping firewood, Isabella wandered around the cabin, her curiosity getting the better of her. On a small shelf, tucked behind a stack of books, she found a framed photograph of a young woman with a warm, radiant smile. When Liam returned, she held up the photo. "Who is she?" His expression immediately darkened, and he took the picture from her hands, setting it face down on the table. "No one you need to worry about," he said curtly. The abruptness of his response startled her, and she didn't press further. But the moment lingered, a small crack in the connection they had been building. Isabella couldn't help but wonder who the woman in the photograph was, and why Liam seemed so determined to keep her in the past. Despite the tension, their shared moments continued to grow richer, each interaction peeling back another layer of their guarded personalities. For the first time in her life, Isabella felt seen not for her name or status, but for who she truly was. And though Liam rarely said much, his actions spoke volumes, showing her a kind of care and respect she had never experienced before. But even in the warmth of their connection, the mysteries of the photograph and Liam's struggles loomed, casting shadows on what might have otherwise been a perfect sanctuary. The sun was setting over the fields as Liam finished patching the fence along the edge of his property. Isabella stood nearby, holding Max's leash, watching him work. The rhythm of life on the farm had begun to feel almost normal to her, though the simplicity of it still felt foreign compared to the chaos of her former world. But Liam's quiet strength and resilience had a way of grounding her, even when her thoughts drifted to what she had left behind. "You're good at this," she said, breaking the silence. Liam looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Good at what?" "Everything," Isabella replied, gesturing to the fence, the fields, the cabin in the distance. "Keeping all of this going even when it feels impossible." He shrugged, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It's not about being good. It's about doing what needs to be done." There was a pause, a natural lull in the conversation, but Liam's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. Something about her didn't add up. He'd noticed it from the beginning. The way she carried herself, the precision of her words, her occasional slips into the kind of vocabulary he only heard on the rare occasions he visited the city. She had claimed to be lost, stranded after her car broke down, but the pieces didn't quite fit. "You know," he began, his tone casual but probing, "you've never really told me much about yourself." Isabella stiffened, her grip on Max's leash tightening. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Liam said, leaning against the fence post, "you're clearly not from around here. And you're not exactly the kind of person I'd expect to find wandering alone in the woods." She hesitated, her mind racing. She had worked so hard to blend in, to leave behind the weight of her identity, but Liam's perceptiveness left her exposed. Finally, she sighed, knowing she couldn't keep the truth from him any longer. "My name is Isabella Hayes," she said softly. "My father is Robert Hayes." Liam raised an eyebrow, the name sparking recognition. "The billionaire?" She nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. I didn't tell you because people treat me differently when they know. They assume things about me, and I didn't want that. Liam stared at her for a moment, processing the revelation. He had suspected she came from money, but the daughter of one of the richest men in the country? That was something else entirely. Why were you out there? He asked, his tone still calm but tinged with curiosity. Why leave all of that behind? Isabella hesitated again, then opened up about the argument with her father, her frustration with his control over her life, and her desire to escape the suffocating expectations that came with being a Hayes. I just needed to breathe, she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. And then everything went wrong. Liam nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. All right, she repeated, surprised by his lack of reaction. Yeah, he said with a shrug. It doesn't change anything. You're still the same person who helped me pick apples yesterday and complained about Max stealing your socks? She laughed despite herself, the tension in her chest easing. But while Liam's words reassured her, she noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor. He was still kind, still steady, but there was a distance now, a wall she hadn't seen before. The next morning, as Liam tended to his fields, the tranquility of the farm was shattered by the roar of truck engines. Isabella looked out from the porch as three men approached, their suits and polished shoes glaringly out of place against the backdrop of dirt and grass. Liam stepped forward to meet them, Max growling low at his side. Mr. Carter, one of the men said, his tone clipped and professional. I'm here on behalf of Green Horizons Development. We've made you several offers for this property, all of which you've ignored, and I'll keep ignoring them, Liam replied, his voice firm. I'm not selling. The man's expression hardened. You might want to reconsider. Your debts are mounting and foreclosure is inevitable. Selling now would be in your best interest. Isabella clenched her fists as she watched from the porch. The man's tone was dripping with condescension, and she could see the tension in Liam's shoulders as he squared off against them. She wanted to intervene, to tell them to leave, but she knew this was Liam's fight. I'll figure it out, Liam said, his voice steady despite the weight of their words. This farm isn't for sale. The men exchanged looks before the lead developer stepped closer, his voice lowering to a threatening whisper. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Isabella's frustration boiled over. Enough, she shouted, storming down the steps. He said no. Now get off this property. The developers turned to her, their expressions a mix of surprise and disdain. The lead man sneered. And who might you be? Someone who isn't afraid of you, she shot back, her voice cold and unyielding. Now leave. After a tense moment, the developers retreated, though the smug look on the lead man's face left no doubt that they'd be back. Isabella turned to Liam, her anger fading into concern. Are you all right? I didn't need your help, he said, his tone sharper than she expected. I wasn't going to just stand there, she argued. They were trying to bully you. Liam shook his head and walked past her, his shoulders tense. Isabella stood there, unsure of what else to say, the first cracks in their fragile trust beginning to show. Later that day, as Isabella replayed the confrontation in her mind, something about the lead developer nagged at her. There was a familiarity in his face, in the way he carried himself. It wasn't until she spotted a logo on one of the papers he had left behind that everything clicked. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the name of her father's company. The man who had threatened Liam worked for Hayes Industries. Liam, she called, rushing to find him. He was in the barn, repairing a piece of equipment, his expression still guarded from their earlier exchange. What is it? He asked, his tone clipped. The developers, she said, holding up the paper. They're connected to my father's company. Hayes Industries owns Green Horizons. Liam froze, the weight of her words sinking in. He turned to face her, his jaw tightening. And you're just now telling me this? I didn't know, she said quickly. I swear, I had no idea. But her explanation only seemed to deepen the crack between them. Liam's voice was quiet but laced with anger. How do I know that? How do I know you weren't sent here to manipulate me, to make me let my guard down? What? She asked, her voice breaking. You think I'm part of this? Liam shook his head, stepping away. I don't know what to think anymore. The words hit her like a blow, And for the first time, Isabella felt the full weight of her father's influence pressing down on her new life. She had fought so hard to escape his shadow, but it had found her here, threatening to destroy the only real connection she had ever felt. As Liam walked away, the fragile trust they had built lay shattered, and Isabella was left standing alone, unsure of how to fix what had been broken. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a thick silence filling the space where laughter and quiet understanding had once thrived. Liam kept his distance, focusing on his work outside while Isabella lingered indoors, feeling more like an intruder with each passing hour. Every attempt she made to explain herself was met with a guarded response, his trust eroded by the revelation that her family was tied to the people threatening his livelihood. One evening, unable to bear the distance any longer, Isabella followed Liam to the barn where he was repairing an old tractor. The rhythmic clang of metal against metal filled the space, drowning out her hesitant steps. "Liam," she began softly, but her voice wavered. He didn't look up, his focus remaining on the task in front of him. "I need you to believe me. I didn't know about my father's involvement. If I had, you would have done what?" Liam interrupted, his voice calm but cold. He straightened, wiping grease from his hands. "Told me the truth from the start? Warned me before they showed up on my land? I would have stopped it," Isabella insisted, her eyes pleading. "I didn't choose this, Liam. I came here to get away from that world, not to bring it to your doorstep." For a moment, he met her gaze, and she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the conflict between his hurt and the part of him that still wanted to trust her. But he shook his head and turned back to the tractor. "It doesn't matter. They're not going to stop, and neither will your father. This is just another business deal to him, and people like me are nothing more than obstacles." His words cut deep, leaving Isabella standing there, her throat tight with unshed tears. She wanted to fight, to convince him that she could be different, but she could feel the wall he had built between them, and she didn't know how to break it. That night, as she lay awake in the guest room, a plan began to form. If she couldn't make Liam believe her with words, she would prove it with actions. Quietly, she retrieved her phone and called an old friend from her life in the city, someone who had once worked for her father's company. The conversation was brief but pointed, and by the time she hung up, she had the information she needed to dig deeper. Over the next few days, Isabella threw herself into uncovering the truth. Through her contact, she gained access to internal documents detailing Hayes Industries' plans for Liam's land. What she discovered made her stomach churn. The company had been targeting small farms like his across the region, acquiring the properties under duress to build a sprawling luxury resort. But the final blow came when she saw her father's name scrawled across the bottom of the approval forms. Not only had he sanctioned the project, but he had also personally signed off on the aggressive tactics used to pressure landowners into selling. The father she had always resented for his control and coldness now felt like a stranger, a man capable of ruthless actions that went far beyond anything she had imagined. Armed with this knowledge, Isabella confronted Liam once more. She found him by the creek, the same place he had found her that fateful night. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was almost loud enough to drown out her nerves as she approached. "I have proof," she said, holding out the folder she had compiled. "It's all here, what they're doing, how they're doing it. My father, he's behind it all." Liam looked at the folder but didn't take it. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" he asked, his tone weary. "It doesn't change anything. They'll still come for this land, and I'll still have to fight them. It changes everything," Isabella said, stepping closer. "If we expose this, if we show what they're doing, they won't be able to continue. We can stop them. We..." Liam echoed, his voice hardening. "There's no we in this, Isabella. You're still part of that world, no matter how much you want to pretend you're not." His words stung, but Isabella refused to back down. "I didn't choose to be born into it, Liam, but I'm choosing to fight against it now. Doesn't that count for something?" Liam stared at her for a long moment, the conflict in his eyes mirroring her own. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't know if I can trust you, Isabella. You're tied to the man who's trying to destroy everything I've worked for. How do I know this isn't just another move in their game?" The weight of his doubt crushed her, and for the first time since arriving at the farm, she felt truly helpless. "I'm trying to help you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Because I care about you. Because I believe in what you're doing here." But Liam turned away, his shoulders tense. "Maybe the best way to help is to leave." His words left her reeling, but she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "If that's what you want," she whispered. That night, as she packed her few belongings, the farm felt colder, emptier than it ever had. The place that had become her sanctuary now felt like a distant memory, a chapter closing far too soon. She left a note on the kitchen table for Liam, thanking him for everything and promising to fight for him, even from afar. As she drove away, the moonlit fields stretching out behind her, Isabella vowed that she wouldn't let her father win. Even if it meant standing against her own family, she would find a way to make things right, for Liam, for the farm, and for herself. The grand gates of the Hayes family estate loomed ahead as Isabella's car rolled to a stop. The sprawling mansion, with its manicured gardens and towering facade, had always been a symbol of wealth and power, but now it felt suffocating, a monument to everything she was fighting against. She stepped out, determination burning in her eyes as she marched up the marble steps and pushed through the double doors without waiting for permission. Robert Hayes sat in his study, flanked by walls of leather-bound books that spoke of intellect and control. He looked up from his desk as Isabella entered, his expression unreadable. "Isabella," he said, setting his pen down. "To whom do I owe this surprise?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you're doing," she said, her voice steady but cold. "Liam's land, the other farms, the intimidation, the threats. It's all you." Robert leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I see you've been keeping busy," he said calmly. "But you're overreacting. It's just business, Isabella. Nothing more. Just business," she snapped, stepping closer. "You're ruining people's lives. Families who have worked that land for generations. For what? A luxury resort?" Robert's expression hardened, his tone taking on a sharper edge. "That land is insignificant compared to the potential revenue this project will generate. Do you have any idea how many jobs it will create? How much will it contribute to the economy?" "Don't patronize me," Isabella shot back. "You're not doing this for the economy or jobs. You're doing it because you can. Because you think no one will stand up to you." Her father's gaze turned icy. "And what do you plan to do about it? Lecture me? Throw a tantrum?" "No," Isabella said, her voice low but fierce. "I'll expose you. Every shady deal, every unethical practice. I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of man you are." For the first time, Robert seemed genuinely taken aback. "You'd turn against your own family?" "You turned against me first," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You've controlled my life for years, but I won't let you control this. Liam and the others deserve better, and I'm going to make sure they get it." Robert's face darkened, and he rose from his chair. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, Isabella." "Maybe not," she said, standing her ground. "But I know what's right and I won't stop until I've undone this." She turned and walked out, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of her father's threat lingered, but she refused to let it deter her. For the first time, she felt truly free, even if it meant standing alone. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Liam was jolted awake by the sound of machinery. He threw on his boots and rushed outside, Max barking furiously at his heels. In the distance, the growl of bulldozers and the shouts of workers echoed through the morning air. He sprinted toward the edge of his property, where a group of developers had begun clearing the neighboring fields. "Hey!" Liam shouted, his voice carrying over the commotion. "You can't do this." One of the workers glanced at him, then shrugged. "We're just following orders." Liam's anger surged. "This land doesn't belong to you." Another man, clearly a supervisor, approached with a smug grin. "It will soon. Contracts are already in motion." Fury boiling over, Liam marched back to his cabin and began making calls. By midday, a group of neighboring farmers had gathered, their faces set with determination. Together, they blocked the entrance to the site, holding signs and shouting their defiance. The local media soon arrived, cameras capturing the growing protest. As the hours passed, the crowd swelled. Liam stood at the forefront, his voice hoarse from rallying the group. Despite the chaos, he felt a spark of hope. Finally, they were being heard. The hum of tension reached its peak as a car pulled up to the protest site. All eyes turned as Isabella stepped out, flanked by a group of lawyers dressed in sharp suits. She looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling at the sight of Liam standing resolute among his neighbors. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the noise around them faded. She saw the surprise in his expression, the faint flicker of hope. "I told you I'd help," she said as she approached, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Liam didn't respond immediately, but the gratitude in his gaze was unmistakable. He stepped aside as Isabella turned to address the crowd. "My name is Isabella Hayes," she began, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "And I'm here to stop this." She gestured to her team of lawyers, who began distributing documents to the protesters and media. These papers detail illegal actions taken by Green Horizons and Hayes Industries to force landowners into selling their properties. Threats, forged contracts, and violations of zoning laws. "This project isn't just unethical, it's illegal." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and the media surged forward, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions. The developers, visibly rattled, began retreating, their confidence shaken. One of the lawyers stepped forward. "A cease and desist order has been filed. Any further action on this land will result in criminal charges." The crowd erupted in cheers, the weight of their struggle momentarily lifted. Liam turned to Isabella, his voice low. "How did you?" "I used what I knew," she said simply. "My father may have taught me a lot about power, but he also taught me how to fight it." Liam nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you." The victory, however, came at a cost. Later that evening, Isabella's phone buzzed with a message from her father. The words were simple but devastating. "You're no longer my daughter. Don't come back." She read the message twice, her chest tightening. She had expected this, but the finality of it still hurt. Taking a deep breath, she turned off her phone and looked out at the stars above the farm. For the first time, she felt untethered, not to her father's control or her family's fortune, but to something greater, the freedom to choose her own path. And she had chosen. The days that followed the protest felt like a new beginning. The bulldozers were gone, the developers silenced by the weight of the legal actions Isabella had set in motion. For the first time in years, the land seemed to breathe again. The air was lighter, the sounds of the farm, rustling leaves, the clucking of chickens, and the distant mooing of cows, returning to their rightful place. Liam stood at the edge of his field, surveying the damage left behind by the developers. Though they hadn't touched his land, the scars on the neighboring plots were a stark reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. He turned as Isabella approached, a basket of fresh eggs in her hands and Max trotting faithfully at her side. "You're up early," Liam said, his tone warmer than it had been in weeks. "Figured I'd start pulling my weight," Isabella replied with a small smile. "I'm not much of a farmer yet, but I'm learning." Liam chuckled, shaking his head. "You've done more than enough." The community had rallied around Liam and the other farmers, inspired by the public outcry and the media attention their protest had garnered. Neighbors helped rebuild fences, plant crops, and repair equipment. Isabella worked alongside them, her manicured hands blistered and dirty, a far cry from the polished woman who had arrived at the farm weeks ago. As the farm slowly returned to life, so too did the bond between Liam and Isabella. The distrust and hurt that had once stood between them faded, replaced by a quiet understanding born of shared struggles and mutual respect. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Liam and Isabella sat on the porch of the cabin.